When we were in the rotunda down at the other end of the hall a few weeks ago, we started a series about when God asks the ridiculous. And we looked at Luke chapter 5, and this is where Jesus told Peter, the commercial fisherman, how to fish. And sometimes we feel like God's asking us something ridiculous because we're the expert, because we know what's best in our lives, or maybe there's some pride getting in the way. And so, God, that's ridiculous. Why are you asking me at that? Tonight, we're going to come at that ridiculous concept in a different angle. And what if God asks us something, and we think it's ridiculous just because we're scared? We're scared of what he's asking us to do. Believe it or not, I used to be terrified of public speaking. And the whole knees knocking, hands shaking, cold sweat, terrified of public speaking. And so it's kind of ridiculous that God led me out of a field of numbers and experiments and chemicals and into a field of preaching and communicating with people, where that's my primary responsibilities. And even some years after switching into campus ministry, I would still get so worked up and so nervous before speaking on a Tuesday night. Or if I was speaking at a church, or if I was at a retreat or a bigger than usual crowd, I'd still get that nervousness, even years into having the experience of doing that. And that fear goes way back. Back in high school, I had this oral communications class, and I just dreaded it every time. I definitely had the knees knocking, shook some of my paper notes a number of times, I'm sure. But I wasn't the worst in the class as far as the nervousness goes. There was this girl who was a grade ahead of me, and her name was Kim. And Kim was a senior. She was a varsity cheerleader. She ran track. She was in National Honor Society, Student Council, Homecoming Court. In my eyes, she was Miss Popularity. But as a senior in high school, Kim was mortified of public speaking. And she could jump around and do chants and work up a football crowd, so no one would have expected that she was deathly afraid of public speaking when it came her first turn to speak in that class. The point is, even if others see us as confident, strong, well-liked people, we can still have major fears inside of us, or places we just feel inadequate about. And you don't have to be known as a fearful person for fears to affect you. You don't have to be known as a fearful person for fears to affect you. So what if God leads you straight into one of your fears? Or maybe you don't even realize you have a fear until God says, go there. And you're like, I wasn't expecting that. What do we do in that situation? We're going to read a narrative from the Bible about that. We're going to look it's in Numbers chapters 13 and 14. We're just going to hit the highlights of the passages there. So you're welcome to turn there. It's towards the beginning of the Bible. And we're going to start Numbers 13, verses 1 and 2. I'll just read those tonight. So verses 1 and 2, Numbers 13. The Lord said to Moses, send some men to explore the land of Canaan, which I am giving to the Israelites. From each ancestral tribe, send one of its leaders. Then verses 17 through 20. Skip down a bit. Verse 17. When Moses sent the people to explore Canaan, he said, go up through the Negev into the hill country. See what the land is like, whether the people who live there are strong or weak, few or many. What kind of land do they live in? Is it good or bad? What kind of towns do they live in? Are they walled or unwalled or fortified? How's the soil? Is it fertile or poor? Are there trees in it or not? Do your best to bring back some of the fruit of the land. It is the season for the first ripe grapes. So let's set up the context. Got a map here of Israel. The yellow represents the current nation of Israel. The blue represents what the original promised land looked like when God promised it to the Jews. And so they were slaves in Egypt. They leave Egypt. Their journey from Egypt to Kadesh was supernatural, at every step along the way. So God sends 10 plagues on Egypt. They finally are able to let go. Supernatural plagues kind of mock the false gods of Egypt. They cross through the Red Sea on dry ground with a wall of water on each side. They kind of wander around this desert of Sinai with a pillar of cloud leading them by the day, and it turned into a pillar of fire at night. They ate bread and water in the middle of the desert, over 1 million people every day. And God brings them to Mount Sinai, and he gives them the 10 Commandments. God audibly spoke the 10 Commandments to the whole nation with the trumpet sound and the mountain on fire. So it's pretty much like the burning bush times 1 million. And it was the whole nation, not just Moses, who heard that. Then God gives Moses the rest of the Old Testament law. He gives him the instructions for the Ark of the Covenant, like from Indiana Jones, and the tabernacle, which was like the 10th version of the temple. And they finally work their way up to Kadesh. They're on the edge of the promised land. Say, go in, check out the land. It's the promised land. I promise to you, it's yours. Just go check it out. See how good it is, and we can draw up some battle plans. So, let's continue with verses 21 through 25. Numbers 13, verses 21 through 25. So they went up and explored the land from the desert of Zin as far as Rahab, toward Limo Hamath. They went up through the Negev and came to Hebron, where Ahiman, Sheshai, and Talmai, the descendants of Anak, lived. Hebron had been built 7 years before Zoan in Egypt. When they reached the valley of Eshcol, they cut off a branch bearing a single cluster of grapes. 2 of them carried it on a pole between them, along with some pomegranates and figs. That place was called the Valley of Eshcol because of the cluster of grapes the Israelites cut off there. At the end of 40 days, they returned from exploring the land. So they explored this whole blue area for 40 days, and we're not exactly sure where some of those places were, including the Valley of Eshcol, but that valley was named after the grapes that they picked, and they got there. Eshcol is a Hebrew word for cluster. And they carried a single cluster of grapes on a pole between 2 of them. And so what might that have looked like? We've got a couple demonstrators to show us what that might have looked like. We have a couple spies carrying some grapes here on a pole. This is the modern take on spies, what they might have looked like. So, we got some grapes. The text doesn't give any idea about the size of the grape cluster, except they named the valley after it. And it was carried on a pole between 2 men. So it was just like a normal little cluster of grapes that looked kind of puny on a pole between 2 guys. So we can assume it was, whether it was big fruit or just a huge cluster of fruit, it was a big cluster of grapes. Thanks, guys. You can go eat the grapes. So the Promised Land was a very good land indeed. It was an awesome land that God was bringing them into. Oh, and there's one other thing. The people who live there now are giants. What? Yes, they're giants, as in the ancestors of Goliath. So Genesis gives us an interesting insight about them. Genesis 6, verse 4 says, the Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God went to the daughters of humans and had children by them. They were the heroes of old, men of renown. So, sons of God. Jesus is the only capital S Son of God, but the Bible refers to other sons of God. Pretty much anyone whom God directly created. So, Adam, the original man, not our Adam, Luke 3:38 says that Adam was the Son of God. Job 1:6 calls the angels sons of God. And then Christians, we're also considered the children of God because when we get saved, we become a new creation in Christ. So The sons of God in Genesis 6:4 was talking about angels. Angels or demons who took on physical form and hooked up with some human women, which sounds really weird, but that's what the Bible is saying it's happened. And their children were called the Nephilim. And they were known as mighty heroes, men of renown. It wouldn't be too far of a stretch to think that the whole Greek and Roman mythology idea of demigods probably came from the Nephilim. Anak is one who is mentioned in our theme passage, was a particular descendant of the Nephilim, and Anak and all his descendants were giants. In various places in the Old Testament, these giants were known as Nephilim, Rephaim, or Anakim. Anakim as in the descendants of Anak, not as in Anakin, who became Darth Vader. It's a different person. So there's a particular descendant of the Nephilim who we have an exact height for, and his name was Goliath. Everyone heard of Goliath? David and Goliath? His height was 6 cubits and a span. Since we don't think in terms of cubits and spans, let's get a visual on how big this guy was. So, we're going to start with someone we're familiar with, Holly Goodnight, coming in at 5'1.5". If she stretches, maybe 5'2". Next on our list, we have Adam Cook coming in at 6'8". Next on the list, Andre the Giant, who's in The Princess Bride, who's also a professional wrestler, coming in at 7'4". Next to him is Yao Ming at 7'6", a professional basketball player. After that is Robert Wadlow. He was 8'11" tall. He was the tallest human in medical history, which means a doctor officially measured him. And he was still growing at age 22 when he died of an infection caused by a leg brace. And then we have Goliath, the Gittite, Goliath from Gath, coming in at 9'9". So Adam would have almost come up to his armpit. This was the height of Goliath, the giant. And Goliath just happened to be the one giant mentioned in the Bible that we have a measurement for. But he was several generations removed from the giants who lived in the land during the time of Moses. And there were a lot more of them at that time. So it is quite possible that the guys living there at that time were even bigger than Goliath was. Maybe around that size, maybe a little bigger, maybe a little smaller. We don't really know. So, after the 40 days of exploring, the spies come back to Kadesh, which is that town on the border of the Promised Land, to show off the fruit, the grapes, and they had some pomegranates and other things, and they gave the recommendations. Those 12 spies they were unanimous in agreeing that the land was exceedingly good, but they were divided on how to proceed. Numbers 13, go back, we're going to look at verses 30 through 33 to continue the story. Verses 30 through 33. Then Caleb silenced the people before Moses and said, "We should go up and take possession of the land, for we can certainly do it." But the men who had gone up with him said, "We can't attack those people. They're stronger than we are." These spread among the Israelites a bad report about the land they had explored. They said, "The land we explored devours those who live in it. All the people we saw there are of great size. We saw the Nephilim there. The descendants of Anak come from the Nephilim. We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes and looked the same to them." So they were intimidated by these giant people living in the land. Caleb and Joshua were saying, "This is awesome. This is exciting. This is thrilling. God's given them into our hands. Let's go do it." And the other guy's like, "There's giants. Are you kidding? We can't do that." They were terrified and started to talk the crowd out of going into the Promised Land. They said we should go back to Egypt. Egypt, where they were in slavery. They were talking about going back there. So Joshua And Joshua and Caleb tried to convince them, yes, we need to go in. So we're going to look at chapter 14, verses 6 through 11. Joshua son of Nun and Caleb son of Jephunneh, who were among those who had explored the land, tore their clothes. They said to the entire Israelite assembly, "The land we passed through and explored is exceedingly good. If the Lord is pleased with us, he will lead us into that land, a land flowing with milk and honey, and will give it to us. Only do not rebel against the Lord. Do not be afraid of the people of the land, because we will devour them. Their protection is gone, but the Lord is with us. Do not be afraid of them." 12 spies, 2 of them, God's with us, let's go in. The other 10, are you kidding? There's giants. Giants, did you see them? Let's go back to Egypt. This is ridiculous. We're heading out. So, now, this really happened. This isn't just some myth. This isn't just some story. This was history. And there were literally giants that God told his people to go in and conquer their land. And but this story is also a challenge for us. When God leads me toward a fear, how will I respond? When God leads me toward a fear, how will I respond? The 10 of the spies were afraid for their lives. And people tend to get a little panicky when that's the situation. It is possible that God may lead you to serve him in some savage tribe, or a place where Christianity is illegal, or a place where there's a lot of violent crime, or a lot of occult practices going on. There are certain situations where your life may be on the line for following God. But there are also some everyday fears that apply to all of us. They're universal. Some of the fears that might come up in everyday life for following God is fear of speaking God's truth, fear of rejection, fear of strangers, fear of not knowing enough, fear of failure, fear of giving up control, fear of missing out, fear of change. If you want to follow Jesus, he will likely lead you into a situation where some of those fears are going to tempt you. And when God leads me towards a fear, how will I respond? Well, I know how we're going to respond. It's really simple. Which do I see as bigger in that moment? My God or my fear? If I remember who God is, if I remember what he's done, I'll follow his lead. If all my attention is on the fear, it's going to stop me. If I remember who God is, I will follow his lead. But if all my attention is on the fear, it will stop me. That's pretty much going to happen every time we come up to a fear when we're trying to follow God. Now, there are some healthy fears that God gives us for our good and for our protection. Whether or not you have a fear of heights, probably like me, you have a fear of falling from them. None of us want to do that. So I'm not going to go climb up on top of the library and proclaim at the sky, my faith in God is, my God is bigger than my fear of falling, and hurl myself off. That would just be dumb. I'm not going to do that. There's a healthy fear there not to do something like that. And God's never going to lead us to do something like that. So just remember our context here. We're talking about situations where we feel God's pull, but there's a fear in the way. So God's telling us to do this, but there's a fear in the way. That's the context we're talking about here. And in those situations, if I remember who God is, I'll follow his lead. But if all my attention's on the fear, it will stop me. And that's why Joshua and Caleb had confidence to go take the promised land. They knew God was calling them to do it. They knew that God was infinitely bigger than the giants. He wasn't just a little bit bigger, a few inches. He was infinitely bigger than the giants he had called them to go defeat. They said, look, their protection is gone. The giants had their time. They don't have God's favor. We have God's favor. So let's go do this. God is with us. The other 10 spies could only see giants. They couldn't get past that. The rest of the story, if you continue reading, tells us that the whole nation of Israel, the 1 million+ people, listened to the 10 fearful guys. And as a result of their disobedience, no one from that generation got to step foot in the promised land, except Joshua and Caleb. But God made them wander around the desert 40 more years till that entire generation died off, and then their kids would go up and take the promised land and defeat the giants. So the book of Joshua picks up with that. At the end of those 40 years, they go in and they take the land. So Joshua and Caleb were the only two from that previous generation who got to taste the fruit of the land. They were the only two who got to tell a story of how God worked through them to conquer giants. They were both in their 80s by that time, so it's probably even funnier, like better story. God, I defeated all these giants back when I was 80. So maybe the story even cooler for them. Some of you said yes to some ridiculous God requests over spring break, and it stressed you, and you saw God move, and I'm proud of you guys for that. Coming up the next week and a half, there's going to be lots more opportunities where God's going to point to something, and our first thought is ridiculous, but we have the opportunity to see God work through that. For those of you who went to, like they talked about earlier, Thursday night, there's an opportunity for more band ministry of witnessing to strangers and help keeping people safe and not driving down the road and they're partying with green beer because it's St. Patrick's Day on Thursday. So if you're interested in that, talk to Heather about going and providing those rides and looking for opportunities to talk to them about God and point them to his house over at Central and make a difference in their lives. Of course, next week is Crave, which is our Bible event. And you might be afraid to take a reading shift and read out loud and have people see you and hear you. You might be afraid to personally invite somebody. You might be afraid to talk to someone you don't know or to ask them what their story with God is. What's their spiritual story? There are a great number of ridiculous things that God could ask us to do over the next week and a half. And if we're paying attention, we're going to see those things. And maybe God will call you to share the gospel with someone during Crave. Maybe God will call you to accept the gospel during Crave. You have the tools. These plastic His House cards that we have, on the back of them have the gospel printed, a very simple version. All the Bibles that we're going to give out at Crave next week, every one of them on the inside cover has a more thorough version of the gospel that you can go to. And so if you can read and if you can find some verses using the table of contents, you have the tools to share the gospel with somebody. It might not be like ideal or perfect or even eloquent by any means, but you have enough of the tools to get started and listen to God pulling you into somewhere that's ridiculous sounding. But you'll be able to see him move and work. So, when that happens, the question will be, which do I see as bigger? My God or my fear? Over the next couple of weeks, if we start to build some momentum as ridiculous Jesus followers, I'm pretty sure he's going to show us some ridiculous fruit. And he'll give us some ridiculous God stories that we can share with others. So let me pray.